In 1901, in the city of Dresden, a series of photographs shocked not only the public but also the scientific community. The images, captured by an amateur photographer named Friedrich Adler, seemed ordinary at first glance. Scenes from a summer fair, people laughing, children running, merchants selling their goods. Yet when the plates were developed, something appeared that should not have been there. In several frames, clear and unmistakable shadows fell across the ground, but there were no bodies attached to them. The existence of these images is not a matter of legend. They were catalogued, briefly exhibited in the Municipal Museum, and later removed under unclear circumstances. Newspaper clippings from the Dresdner Neuesten Nachrichten in August 1901 mention strange photographic irregularities, though the name Adler is never printed. What happened to him and why the negatives vanished from the museum archive remains a question that local historians avoid even today. At the turn of the century, Dresden was a city of music and art, a capital of modern ideas. The annual fair by the Elbe River attracted thousands. Families came dressed in their finest, young men in stiff collars, women carrying parasols against the sun. Friedrich Adler, a clerk at a local insurance office, was known among his friends as a hobbyist with a passion for the new technology of photography. He had purchased a second-hand wooden camera with a brass lens, using glass plates coated with gelatin emulsion. Several neighbors remembered seeing him wander through the fair, carefully arranging his tripod, sometimes asking strangers to hold still for a portrait. What Adler developed a week later in his small apartment darkroom did not match what his eyes had seen. In the first plate, two young women are visible, standing by a balloon vendor. Their dresses, lace collars, and even the parasol handle are perfectly sharp. But cast across the dusty ground is a third shadow, elongated, unmistakable, the outline of a man. No figure is visible in the frame, only the dark form stretching toward the women's feet. Adler at first thought it an accident of double exposure or a smudge from careless handling. But the other plates reveal the same phenomenon, repeated with disturbing consistency. On the second photograph, taken near the carousel, a group of children can be seen laughing, one boy holding a toy drum. Behind them, the shadows of three figures stretch long under the summer sun, except there are only two children in the frame. The third shadow seems to belong to someone bending forward, hands outstretched, but there is no such figure present. The proportions of the shadow are human, too precise to be dismissed as a trick of the lens. Adler, disturbed, brought the plates to a fellow enthusiast, a bookseller named Hans Richter, who owned a small chemical darkroom in the Neustadt district. Richter later gave testimony in a handwritten letter preserved in a private collection that Adler arrived pale and trembling, clutching the plates in a wrapped cloth. Richter confirmed the shadows were on the negatives themselves, not added during printing. His exact words, copied from the letter: "They are not scratches, not stains, they are shadows, cast by what I cannot say, but they are there, and they are real."
Passionate, emotional, faster pace with intensity. Word spread quickly among Adler's circle of acquaintances. By early September, several of the photographs were shown discreetly at a meeting of the Dresden Photographic Society. A few members dismissed them as deliberate forgeries, suggesting Adler had tampered with the plates using lampblack or chemical tricks. Yet others admitted that such manipulation would have been extremely difficult, leaving no trace. One newspaper reporter, Karl Weber, attended the gathering and published a short, cautious note. A peculiar demonstration of photographic error has unsettled the society, images wherein shadows fall without visible subjects. The matter remains under examination. But the public appetite for the bizarre was growing. Soon small crowds gathered outside Adler's apartment, demanding to see the photographs. He refused, locking the plates in a box, fearing theft or ridicule. Neighbors described him as increasingly paranoid, muttering about things in the corners of his rooms and figures that appear when he closes his eyes. Several accounts mention that Adler himself began to notice changes around him. He told Richter that, at dusk, he saw elongated shadows pass along his wall, though the windows were shut and the shutters closed. His landlady, Frau Meisner, recalled that she often heard him pacing through the night, whispering to himself. When she knocked, he refused to open the door. By late October, Adler vanished from Dresden entirely. Police records state he left no forwarding address, no notice to his employer, and left his rent unpaid. His belongings, including the wooden camera, remained in the apartment. Only the box of negatives was missing. The photographs resurfaced briefly the following year when the Dresden Municipal Museum acquired several prints. A 1902 catalog, still preserved, lists item number 147, Photographic Studies of the Elbe Fair, Anonymous Donor. No mention of Adler appears. The prints were displayed for less than 2 months before they were quietly withdrawn. The reason given in internal notes was deterioration and improper exposure. Yet multiple witnesses who viewed the exhibition claimed the shadows were visible, even more distinct on the enlargements. In 1903, the catalog number 147 was crossed out in the museum ledger. The items were marked vermisst, missing. No record of their destruction or transfer exists. By 1904, whispers of the missing photographs had become part of Dresden's cultural gossip. Students at the Academy of Fine Arts joked about painting shadows without models. Yet behind the humor lay genuine unease. The few who had glimpsed Adler's images spoke of an uncanny sensation, as if the shadows in the photographs were aware of the viewer, poised on the threshold of movement. In the spring of that year, a traveling lecturer from Berlin, Dr. Ernst Hoffmann, gave a public talk on the psychology of vision. During the discussion, he was challenged by an attendee who asked whether Hoffmann had seen the shadow plates. Hoffmann, intrigued, inquired further and was eventually led to a private collection belonging to a local merchant named Otto Kellner. Kellner claimed to possess 2 of Adler's original prints, obtained through undisclosed means. Kellner allowed Hoffmann to view the photographs in a dim parlor lit by oil lamps. Hoffmann later recorded his impressions in his lecture notes, preserved in the Berlin.
At first, the plates appear mundane, a fairground, a crowd. Yet upon inspection, one perceives extraneous shadows which correspond to no visible figures. The shadows are not random, they display posture, gesture, and in some cases intimacy of proximity with the visible persons. A hand raised, a head bowed. One feels a trespass of presence. Kellner added a detail that disturbed Hoffmann deeply. He claimed that on nights when he kept the photographs uncovered in his home, he heard faint tapping at the windows as though someone stood outside trying to enter. Twice, his servants refused to remain in the house after dusk, insisting that dark shapes moved along the hallway walls. By July 1904, rumors had reached the press again. Dresdner Neueste Nachrichten ran a cautious piece titled "Are Shadows Alive?", reporting that unnamed collectors were circulating peculiar images believed to be Adler's. The article described a print of children at a fair, accompanied by a looming black form with arms extended, touching the ground though no figure was seen. Letters to the editor poured in, some demanding that the city confiscate the prints as dangerous, others insisting it was nothing more than hoax. The Municipal Museum, embarrassed by the renewed attention, issued a public statement denying possession of such items. Yet a subsequent inventory from 1905, found decades later in the Saxon State Archive, still listed Adler's works as missing, but not destroyed. The bureaucratic contradiction fueled even more speculation. Meanwhile, Hans Richter, the bookseller who had first testified to the authenticity of the plates, met with a strange fate. In December 1905, his shop closed without notice. Neighbors were called hearing arguments inside the night before, voices overlapping with Richter's desperate cries. The police report, though thin on detail, states that the interior of the shop was in disarray, shelves toppled, glass cases shattered. Richter himself was gone. Only one curious object was noted: a series of photographs pinned to the wall behind the counter, each image nearly identical, showing the shop's interior. Except in every print, a long human shadow stretched across the floor, pointing toward the door. The photographs were seized as evidence, but never appeared in the trial records. Richter was officially declared missing, presumed to have fled debts. Those who knew him doubted this explanation. He had spoken repeatedly about Adler's plates in the months before, warning that they let something through. By 1906, Dresden society had begun to treat the matter with a blend of dread and fascination. Coffee houses hosted heated debates about the limits of photography, whether a camera could capture not only light but something unseen. Religious figures preached against tampering with shadows, warning that Adler had opened a window into forbidden realms. In one sermon at the Kreuzkocher, Pastor Wilhelm Kruger thundered, "The shadow belongs to God alone, for it is tied to the soul. To see a shadow without a body is to see the mark of one lost." Parishioners claimed the church was unusually dark that morning, even though sunlight filled the square outside.
The Dresden Municipal Museum maintained its silence, though rumors persisted that Adler's negatives had not been lost, but locked away in a basement vault. A caretaker, interviewed anonymously in 1907, claimed to have seen a sealed crate labeled F.A. among other neglected items. He insisted the crate emitted a faint odor of chemicals, and on one occasion that he heard a sound like fingers brushing against wood when he passed it. The museum directors denied the existence of any such crate. Yet in 1908, a fire broke out in the museum's basement, destroying several storage rooms. Officially, the cause was attributed to faulty wiring. Unofficially, whispers circulated that the flames seemed to originate from a single locked chest, which burned hotter and longer than any surrounding material. By the turn of the decade, Adler's name had nearly vanished from public memory. His disappearance was no longer in the papers, and the scandal of the photographs had been buried under newer stories. Yet traces remained in private letters, marginal notes, and obscure archives. A diary entry from 1910, written by a student named Clara Henschel, described a clandestine viewing of an image where shadows reached across the fairground, touching children's hands. Clara ended her note with a chilling line. "When I left the house that evening, I walked without casting a shadow, and only realized it when I returned home." Researchers who attempted to catalog these fragments noted a pattern. Those who studied the photographs too closely often disappeared, suffered breakdowns, or spoke of being followed by indistinct shapes. The phenomenon seemed less about the photographs themselves and more about what they revealed, or perhaps what they invited. By 1911, the Adler case had transformed into something beyond photography. It had become a cautionary tale whispered in Dresden's taverns, a story not of images, but of shadows that lived independent lives. The years after 1911 carried Europe into a new and violent era, and Dresden was no exception. With the outbreak of war in 1914, many stories and rumors faded into the background noise of mobilization, hunger, and loss. Yet in the archives of Saxony, a thin folder dated 1915 survives, marked simply photographic anomalies. Inside are 3 reports written by a military clerk, each one describing strange disturbances in the photographic records of soldiers departing for the front. The first note describes a regimental portrait taken on the Neustadt Square. 40 men stand in neat rows, rifles at their sides. Yet upon developing the glass plate, the photographer noticed additional shadows on the cobblestones, tall figures bending over the soldiers, their outlines blurred but unmistakably human. These shadows corresponded to no one present in the frame. The photographer swore the plate was clean and undamaged, and he sent the image to the ministry in Berlin. No reply was ever received. Another document in the folder refers to a letter from a nurse at a military hospital. She describes photographs sent to her by families of wounded men. In the images, she claimed, the shadows of the soldiers sometimes appeared detached, standing slightly apart from their bodies, bent at unnatural angles, or reaching toward others in the
frame. The nurse wrote that when she confronted the soldiers, some admitted they had dreams of being followed by shapes at night, shapes that stood at their bedside until dawn. In 1917, a fire destroyed part of the Saxon military archive. The file, Photographical Anomalies, survived only in fragments, singed at the edges. It is uncertain whether the events described were ever investigated further, but the language of the reports echoes Adler's case too closely to dismiss. The recurring theme of shadows without bodies suggests that the phenomenon had spread far beyond a single man's negatives. After the war, Dresden was a city exhausted, stripped of its grandeur, filled with hunger and grief. Yet stories began to circulate once again about photographs that revealed more than they should. In 1920, a journalist named Franz Lichtenberg published a short piece in a cultural review recounting the tale of Adler for a new generation. He hinted that new examples had emerged, citing an anonymous collector who showed him a print of the Elbe Fair identical to Adler's lost plate. The collector warned him not to keep notes, claiming that every written record invited the presence of the shadows themselves. Lichtenberg ignored the warning. 2 months later, he was dead, found collapsed in his study. The coroner recorded a heart failure.
His widow swore that in the days before his death, the walls of his study seemed darker than the rest of the house, as if lit from within by shifting silhouettes. The Municipal Museum attempted, once again, to suppress the subject. In their 1921 annual report, the directors dismissed the Adler affair as folklore without evidence. Yet among the museum staff, whispers persisted of sealed crates stored in remote basements. One assistant claimed that during an inventory, he opened a drawer and found a small envelope containing a glass negative. When he held it to the light, he saw the image of a crowd on a fairground with long shadows falling across the dirt. He tried to show the plate to his superior, but when they looked together, the image had gone black, as if overexposed by invisible light. The negative crumbled into dust in his hands. That same year, a traveler from Vienna, the photographer Emil Rau, visited Dresden and claimed to have purchased two of Adler's surviving prints from an antiquarian bookseller. Rau exhibited them briefly in his studio, inviting colleagues to inspect them. Several testified that the prints indeed show shadows without corresponding figures. Rau planned to publish an article on the phenomenon in a photographic journal. He never completed it. In late 1922, his studio burned in a sudden fire that destroyed not only his equipment, but the building itself. The blaze began, according to witnesses, at night, with no candle or stove lit. They said it was as though the fire erupted from the walls themselves. By 1923, the Adler case had entered a twilight space between documented fact and whispered legend. Official records dwindled, yet personal diaries, letters, and fragments of testimony continued to appear. One diary, kept by a theology student named Heinrich Walther, describes his obsession with Adler's photographs. He writes of seeing copies passed hand to hand among students, each image showing not only fairground scenes, but disturbingly, new shadows that had not been in earlier versions. Walther claimed the shadows multiplied over time, changing position with each copy.
Made. In his final entry, dated December 14, 1923, he wrote, "I stood before the mirror, and I did not see myself, only the shadow stretching long behind me." After this date, Walther's diary stops abruptly. He disappeared from the seminary the following week. His belongings were left neatly arranged, his bed made, his books stacked on the desk. The authorities suggested he had abandoned his studies, perhaps fled abroad. His classmates, however, remembered him whispering in the chapel about figures that follow from the corners, waiting to be seen. As the decade moved on, Dresden tried to forget. The rise of new politics, new tensions, new fears made the matter of strange photographs seem trivial. And yet, in the private collections of Europe, copies of Adler's plates continued to circulate. The shadows persisted. By 1924, the Adler photographs had become something of a whispered currency among collectors. They were not advertised nor displayed openly, but traded privately, often late at night, wrapped in envelopes or cloth, exchanged in silence with the weight of contraband. The men who possessed them seldom held them for long. Letters from this period show the same pattern. The owner first described fascination, then unease, then sudden illness, disappearance, or destruction of the prints. One letter, written by a collector in Leipzig named Johannes Fels, has survived in a family archive. Fels describes purchasing a photograph at an antiquarian fair. The image, he wrote, was of children on a fairground, their faces blurred in motion. Yet, among them, fell a shadow larger than all the rest, its arms spread wide, its head elongated unnaturally. Fels reported that the photograph seemed to shift slightly each time he viewed it, the shadow moving closer to the children. He locked the print in a drawer, but in the following weeks, his servants insisted that the house grew darker at unusual hours, that walls seemed to flicker as if lit from inside. Fels's final entry notes that when he attempted to destroy the print with fire, the paper did not burn, but turned cold and brittle. His letter ends mid-sentence. He was never seen again.
In 1925, the Municipal Museum in Dresden made an official statement attempting to put an end to what they called the persistent superstition of shadow photographs. The statement was unusually severe, warning citizens that circulating such images could invite prosecution. Yet even as the museum spoke publicly against them, a rumor began to spread among the staff that a locked drawer in the director's office contained a surviving Adler negative. The director himself, a man named August Reiner, was said to work late into the night, staring at something through a magnifying glass long after the museum had closed. In December of that year, Reiner was found collapsed at his desk, dead of an apparent stroke. On his blotter lay a sheet of paper with graphite markings. The paper showed nothing recognizable at first glance, only long, dark lines, curved and bent like distorted shadows. Visitors to Dresden during these years left their own accounts. An English tourist, Henry Campbell, later published memoirs in which he described being taken to a private house where a group of gentlemen showed him what they called Adler's curse. Campbell saw a print of the Elbe Fair. He admitted in his memoir that he laughed at first, dismissing it as a clever forgery. Yet he added, "As I turned to leave the room, I noticed on the wall behind me the clear outline of a shadow, my own.
I assumed. Yet the position did not match. It raised its hand while mine remained at my side." In 1926, a series of anonymous pamphlets appeared in Dresden, crudely printed and distributed in taverns and markets. They warned citizens to avoid mirrors, cameras, and photographs after nightfall, claiming that shadows had learned to detach from their owners. The pamphlets cited Adler by name, describing him as the man who opened the gate. Authorities dismissed the pamphlets as hysteria, yet the tone of fear in the city grew sharper. One particularly chilling report comes from the journal of a medical student named Victor Hahn. Hahn claimed to have attended a clandestine gathering in the basement of a university building where a professor of physics demonstrated an Adler print projected onto a wall with a lantern. Hahn wrote that as the shadow grew larger, filling the surface of the wall, he and the other attendees saw it begin to shift, bending unnaturally, extending its arms toward the audience. Several fled the room. Hahn swore that when he returned to his lodging, his shadow on the floor was not aligned with his body but lagged slightly behind, as though delayed in its movement. He wrote only one more entry: "It catches up." His journal was found in his empty room. By 1927, references to Adler's prints had spread beyond Dresden. Reports appeared in Prague, Vienna, and Zurich, each describing images of ordinary people with inexplicable shadows beside them. Some claimed the prints originated from Adler's missing negatives, copied countless times. Others suggested that once seen, the phenomenon reproduced itself, appearing in new photographs unconnected to Adler at all. A newspaper in Zurich ran a story that year about a family portrait taken by a respected studio. The image was perfect, except for one detail. A long dark silhouette leaned over the family, a figure that did not belong to anyone present. The studio denied any manipulation and closed within weeks after rumors destroyed their reputation. In Dresden, meanwhile, the silence of the municipal museum became conspicuous. Citizens whispered that the building itself was haunted by shadows. Night watchmen reportedly refused to patrol certain corridors, claiming to see outlines moving against the walls, though the halls were empty. One guard told his wife that he often felt another set of footsteps following his own, but when he turned, he saw only his shadow, and sometimes even that was gone. By the close of the decade, Adler's name was almost erased from public record, yet his presence lingered in darker ways. Collectors who once sought the photographs began to avoid even speaking of them.
Families destroyed albums where inexplicable forms appeared, preferring to lose their memories than risk what might follow. The phenomenon was no longer a curiosity, but a quiet dread woven into the city's unspoken fears. By 1928, the Adler affair had become more than a whispered legend. A series of incidents across Saxony forced the matter briefly back into public discourse, though always shrouded in denial. The first came in January, when a group of architecture students took a photograph of themselves outside the Frauenkirche. The print revealed behind them a towering black silhouette stretching across the
stone facade. The students laughed nervously at first, but within weeks, 2 of them had vanished without explanation. Their families insisted they had left notes hinting at travel abroad, yet the notes were strangely identical in phrasing, as though copied from a single hand. In the summer of that same year, an exhibition of early photography opened in Leipzig. Among the displayed works was an innocuous cityscape of Dresden, dated around 1890. Visitors later claimed that during the exhibition the shadows in the photograph seemed to move, stretching across the frame toward the crowd. The curator denied these accounts, but within days the print was withdrawn. The catalog for the exhibition listed it only as "Unknown Photographer, Dresden Fairground," though those who saw it swore it was Adler's missing plate. A private investigator, Ernst Vogel, became involved after being hired by a merchant whose home had grown, in his words, oppressive with darkness. Vogel's surviving notes, now in a police archive, described discovering several photographs hidden in the merchant's cellar. He wrote that when he held them under lamplight, the shadows began to distort, bending toward the edges of the image as though seeking escape. Vogel abruptly ceased his investigation. His final entry reads simply, "They are not images, they are windows." He died in 1929 of causes never determined. The late 1920s were also years of political upheaval, and many official records were destroyed or altered. Yet fragments remain. A municipal report from Dresden in 1929 mentions an incident at the museum vaults. Though vague, the report alludes to staff resignations following the accidental exposure of sensitive materials. A rumor spread that Adler's negatives had been discovered sealed in a wooden box deep in the archive. The box, according to whispers, contained not only plates but sketches, strange graphite drawings of elongated figures, dark marks across walls, silhouettes bending around corners. The sketches were unsigned, but the handwriting on the notes matched Adler's known hand. In the same year, a Czech journalist named Karel Havlicek traveled to Dresden to investigate. His articles, published in a periodical in Prague, recounted interviews with locals who claimed to have seen Adler himself wandering near the Elbe. Though Adler had been declared missing decades earlier, some swore they recognized his tall frame and heavy coat. One witness said the man carried a camera, but that the lens was covered with cloth, as if he no longer dared to use it. Havlicek concluded his article with the unsettling line, "If Adler lives, then perhaps it is not he who moves the camera, but the shadows that move him." By 1930, the affair reached its darkest turn. A fire consumed part of the municipal museum's storage. While most attributed to faulty wiring, staff members whispered that the blaze began after a new assistant unsealed a crate marked with Adler's name. Survivors of the staff later told friends that the fire seemed to burn without heat, a black flame that left no smoke. Entire rooms were destroyed, yet certain items, chiefly old photographic plates, remained untouched, sitting amid the ashes without a mark. The official report noted only inconsistencies in damage patterns. The final documented mention of Adler's work appears in a letter written in October 1930 by a Dresden schoolteacher. He describes a field trip with a student.
Banks of the Elbe. A local man approached him, offering to take a group photograph. The man produced an old camera, heavy and box-like, and arranged the children in rows. But before he could release the shutter, the teacher noticed that the man's coat was frayed,
his eyes hollow, his shadow absent. Alarmed, the teacher refused and led the children away. Days later he wrote, "I fear it was Adler himself, or what remains of him. I fear he seeks new subjects." The teacher disappeared the following winter. After 1930, silence. The rise of darker forces in Germany soon erased such matters from public attention. The city changed, the archives burned, and many who might have remembered Adler's photographs were lost in the storms that followed. Yet, now and then, a print still surfaces in forgotten attics, private collections, or flea markets. Always the same: blurred crowds, indistinct faces, and shadows that do not belong. And there is one last whisper, carried into the present. In 1972, during the restoration of Dresden after the war, a construction worker found fragments of glass buried in rubble. Holding them against the sun, he claimed to see faint outlines of figures bending across the light. He told his colleagues, half in jest, that the shadows looked back at him. Within a week, he fell from scaffolding to his death. Today, no verified Adler negative survives. The museum denies possessing any, and scholars dismiss the case as folklore. But scattered testimonies remain, stubborn and unresolved. The photographs were seen, copied, passed hand to hand, and those who looked too long into their shadows seldom escaped unchanged. The question lingers, suspended like dust in an old archive. If shadows once detached themselves from the figures in Adler's photographs, where are they now? And in the quiet moments, when a wall grows darker than it should, who can say with certainty that it is only the light playing tricks, and not something that has stepped out, at last, into our world?